UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jenn Durrell.
Hey, baby.
Hey, baby.
I'm super excited about the guest that we have on the show this week. He's somebody that I knew I wanted to get on Talking Weird from the moment that we started the podcast. He's written several fantastic books on cryptids, and just a few of those titles include Momo, The Strange Case of the Missouri Monster, The Beast of Boggy Creek, The True Story of the Fouke Monster, and Monstro Bizarro, an essential manual of mysterious monsters.
Yeah, and he's also part of the Small Town Monsters crew, too.
Yeah, that's right. He's either co-produced, narrated, and or starred in several Small Town Monster documentaries, and a lot of them are fantastic companion pieces to his books, incidentally. Just some of those titles include Momo, the Missouri Monster, Boggy Creek Monster, and The Mothman of Point Pleasant. Anyway, I just want to jump straight into the interview, and I'm delighted to introduce to our audience Lyle Blackburn. You know what fascinated me the other day, Lyle, I found out, was I didn't know you were the lead singer in Ghoultown. And the funny thing is I would have seen you too, because I remember the Elvira clip from Ghoultown. It's like,
yeah,
I didn't put one and one together and come up with two.
yeah. I mean, it's a little bit, two disassociated worlds, but yeah, that's me.
That must have been quite the journey to have gone from rock star to cryptid investigator.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just not something I even intended. I just took a break from the band to write a book, and then it turned into this whole thing. So, I mean, I love all this stuff. So I just thought, well, okay, cool. It's good stuff. I'll go with it.
I guess there is some commonality. I saw the other day, it popped up on my Facebook feed, a fantastic tour of your office, which was just loaded with all of this incredible monster memorabilia and the like.
Yeah. As you can see, I'm just surrounded by sort of monsters and things, and Ghoultown, of course, plays in horror things. And so just about anything I've ever done in my whole life has some commonality with spooky or monsters in some way. So it's not too much of a stretch. And I mean, when I started doing books and being on TV shows, I'd say, a lot of people come up to me and say, "Hey, you're in Ghoultown," or whatever. They see the hat. But I mean, I almost had more people like, "Hey, man, you're the Bigfoot guy." It's like even our fans, they want to talk to me about, something they saw in the woods. So there's really a common interest there, I think.
Yeah, I first discovered your cryptid or Fortean research almost simultaneously, I think. We had the wonderful Boggy Creek Monster documentary submitted to the first year of Midwest Weird Fest, and I think it was around the same time I discovered Monstro Bizarro, the fantastic book that you did for Rue Morgue.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so I've had my hands in several different things, which has helped exposure-wise. I think people have either found me by books or the movies or Rue Morgue or Ghoultown, so it kind of cross-pollinates each other, I think.
I did a few things with Rue Morgue back in the day. I was on their Rue Morgue podcast once, and they were very kind. They used to always push a festival I used to run in Australia, and I think that's where I discovered maybe Ghoultown. I think you were included in one of the compiles that Rue Morgue released once. I think it was Return of the Living Dead was the song I might have first discovered of you guys on that compile.
Yep, that was it. Yeah, the Hymns of Horror, they did that.
That's right. And Momo, Jenn actually gave me, which was the second book of yours I read. I got that for Christmas. Jenn actually is based in Missouri. She's probably about, I think you're 200 miles to the west of Louisiana, Missouri. Is that right, Jenn?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not that far.
Actually, in that Momo book, there's a fascinating older case, which is in Jenn's part of the world, which I didn't know about at all till I read the book, there was a 19th century case of a wild man living in a cave near Sedalia or however you pronounce that town.
Sedalia. What was the name of that creature?
I don't remember offhand what they called it. Sometimes they would call it a wild man in general if it's dates back, 1800s or whatever. Or that there was no term Bigfoot or anything back then, so generally it'd be wild man. Or sometimes they would call it like in the Ozarks down there south of Missouri. There's the Blue Man, which is a name they gave a sort of pseudo Bigfoot like creature. But anytime I investigate something like a Momo case based in the early 1970s, I always want to kind of look back and see, well, is this the first time people have reported this? Do people still have sightings, in a more general area, not just necessarily in the one little town, but all over, which leads to that sort of uncovering of a history of strange sightings, in a place like Missouri, where most people just wouldn't even think Bigfoot type creatures would even exist or be reported at least.
Mm-hmm. I noticed in the Momo documentary that the family sitting outside their house, and then they see these 3 lights, like red lights. They're kind of dancing around, and then they move back to the wood line, and then they hear the creature. Is that something that was typical for the Momo sightings?
Yeah, that was based on an actual incident that happened during the Momo flap of 1972. And the way that documentary, it's a little different than the others we've done because, of course, it's like a movie inside of a movie, and the movie is not necessarily totally accurate. It's sort of like if a movie was made. So, but the things in there, are based on something. And that incident where the lights were seen and then this strange roaring sound was heard happened a couple of days after the initial outbreak of sightings in the small town of Louisiana, Missouri. And at first, some kids saw this creature in their backyard and then called their parents. And it was at this residence of the Harrison family. And then that kind of set it off. And then a few days later, they were having a prayer meeting there at the Harrisons, which they always had like on Wednesday night. And after it was done, some of the people were out talking, getting ready to leave, and they see these strange lights, streak across the sky and go down, over the woods near the home. And then all of a sudden they hear this kind of strange metallic noise and a almost a monstrous sound coming off this Marzoff hill, which was a wooded area that backed up to their home. And they kind of freaked out. And eventually everybody sort of took off running, and they got in a car and started driving down the street. Miss Harrison leans out the window. She saw there was, 30 or 40 townsfolk coming up the road. It's a dead end, and they were coming up there because they could hear all this and see the lights. And she just yells, hangs out of the car and yells something like, they're here, they're coming, run. And everybody turned and ran. But that was a real incident. You can't even make that stuff up.
Oh, wow. That's crazy. That's awesome that they had so many people experience that. I've seen lights myself in sets of 3 at a farm that I lived in several years ago. So that's why that one's so interesting to me.
Yeah, it was kind of the first one where I did sort of have to analyze UFO sightings in conjunction with Bigfoot sightings, because in the majority of my books, I deal more strictly with a cryptid case where nobody necessarily reports any strangeness like that. But in the Momo case, there was sort of a convergence of UFO sightings of a strange, hairy biped, even stuff like disembodied voices being heard in the woods. So it was more of a paranormal case that spans sort of categories there. So, just like in any of my books, I just simply research as best I can and tell the story as it was, and people can make their judgments from that. Yeah.
It's a great book, by the way.
And one of the things I enjoyed most about the book is that you're happy to look at Stan Gordon's writings and John Keel's writings, and you don't seem to lock yourself into that single, well, it's definitely going to be, a wild hairy man in the woods, or it's definitely a this, or it's a definitely a that. You seem comfortable to at least mention that there's paranormal interpretations or there's strange extraterrestrial interpretations. And I think you really do leave it up for your readership to kind of to look at all of this and then walk away and either do more research or, come to their own conclusions based on your writings, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I definitely try to look at this sort of an investigative journalist style. A lot of people come at this, they might believe in a certain phenomenon and then they're trying to, I don't know, come at it from only that one perspective. And while I may typically err on the side of there's an explanation or, cryptids aren't, Bigfoot's not necessarily from outer space, I have to tell the story as it is, and I have to admit that I can't prove anything I believe any more than anybody else can, conclusively, prove anything. So I think it's more fascinating to just tell the story because the story in and of itself is interesting, whether you prove it or don't prove it or believe one thing or the other. It's just, like I said, people running down the street screaming that they're here and they're coming, and townsfolk with, villagers with pitchforks coming up the street in the 1970s. I mean, that's some crazy stuff. So I definitely try to just tell the story,
Have you ever had a personal encounter with a Bigfoot?
No, I've never actually, seen anything I could definitively say was a Bigfoot. I've had some strange things happen in the woods, and I believe possibly one of the creatures was nearby on a couple of occasions, but I never could quite see it. So I wouldn't say I've, seen one.
I think the setting, obviously, when the cases take place both in Boggy Creek and in Momo, which is your work I'm more familiar with, I love how there's a sense in both of those, and it comes across particularly, I think, in the Boggy Creek Monster movie that you did with Small Town Monsters as well, but also at the end of Momo, there's a sense not just that somehow is the creature elusive, but that time period's elusive as well. There's almost a sentimentality, which I really dig in your work about that period of cryptid sightings.
Yeah, I definitely like that era, and I tend to revisit that quite a bit. And I probably romanticized that 1970s sort of the peak of high strangeness that was going on when everybody seemed to have an open mind about this stuff. And, a lot of the seminal events were happening. The Boggy Creek case and Momo and the Patterson Gimlin film had happened there in the late 60s, and all the things that were still that have become the icons of cryptozoology or, UFO things that, are still notable. A lot of those came out of that time period. So I really like that. And, I deal a lot with the South or Midwest and South type stuff. So I really try to play in to write about the area and the people and the time period in which those things happen as best I can.
You seem to have a real understanding of the people and the places of rural America, whether it's from Texas, where I know you're from, or up through Arkansas or into Missouri, and that shines through even in quite a bit of your narrative in the Boggy Creek documentary, where you explain that you're used to these kind of areas because you hunted in small towns like it or near it when you were younger with your father. So does that background draw you particularly to looking at those type of rural cases in that area as well, or in those areas as well?
Yeah, it definitely does. I just think those have a lot of, character and color to them. And I'm just as familiar, going into an old shack in the middle of the woods at the edge of a swamp as I am, in the big city here in Dallas. So I can integrate well with those environments and the people and sort of a simpler way of life and a sort of a sometimes a less jaded view of this. People just say, I saw this or my cousin saw this, and it's just a fact. They don't they don't try to read too much into it. They're not cynical about it, and mostly, and this is just facts that go on in their part of the country. So I like to, just immerse myself in that and get to know the people and try to bring that to the narrative as much as I can, because I mean, I like books that just have, there's Bigfoot sightings and there's this and that. But in my books, I think you get to know the people a little better, or the place a little better, because it's set. Most of those books are set in one place, including my Lizard Man book, which is in South Carolina.
You just mentioned swamps, and I had some other questions I still want to ask you about Momo and the Fouke Monster and the like, but I just saw that your next book coming out is Sinister Swamps, Monsters and Mysteries from the Mire, so I'm guessing we have some interesting swamp tales to look forward to.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely. That plays right into kind of what you're asking me about, those kind of areas. And over the years, I just love the swampy environments, and anytime I'm out investigating the areas and been able to go on expeditions, or just, go into these kind of spooky places, I just think the swamps just have something that other places don't have. So I've been kind of compiling different, encounters and reports and information on some of the different swamps that I've been to over the years, and thought, man, this would make a great book where I just kind of concentrate. Instead of just on one case or one kind of creature, I concentrate geographically on a type of location, like a swamp, where if you start looking at these, there's all kinds of paranormal activity that takes place in there. And of course, it's a good spooky setting. And, I just think those are colorful type environments. So the new book, is focused solely on that.
Oh, I can't wait to read it. Can you give us a little teaser of maybe one or two of your favorite stories from that book?
Yeah, I cover so many notable swamps in there. And of course, you can't get them all in one volume. So, it may be that I write more if this book is successful. Some of there's so much good stuff. It's hard to say. The Hockomock Swamp, which people may be familiar with if you studied paranormal, located in Massachusetts, within the Bridgewater Triangle, which is a sort of a general area of paranormal activity. And the Hockomock Swamp is within there. And, I open up the book with, a guy who's driving near there. He works at a prison, and he's just on his nightly drive, which is a pleasant drive that winds its way right through the edge of that swampy area of Hockomock. And it's late, and he's just been on his shift at one of the local prisons, and all of a sudden he looks up, and this strange canid wolf-like thing comes bounding out of the swampy bottoms and runs across the road right in front of his headlights. And the way he went on to describe it, I mean, it's sort of wolf-like, it's sort of dog-like, hyena-like. It doesn't fit any one thing. It just seems as though this creature is, I don't know, just unique, and something that one second it's there and the next second it's gone, and it disappears into the darkness of the trees that are in the standing water of the swamp. And there's no way to pursue it. There's no way you would even get out of the car. But even if you could, it just disappears into this rugged terrain. And who knows, and so when I'm interviewing this person, I can tell that it frightened them. And of course, if you think about yourself in that position, he's out there in the middle of nowhere. He sort of stops, and, you just kind of come to the realization that anything could run out here and grab me, and nobody would know the difference, if it pulled the door handle off. And, there was another case like that in Florida where some guys are driving near one of the swamps down there. Florida, of course, is covered in swamps, and they drive up and they see this upright, hairy, man-like thing trying to get in a car that was parked on the side of the road. And they saw a man jump out and try to run into the woods, and whatever this thing was appeared to be trying to get him. And they disappear into the woods, and these guys, they don't even bother to try to help the guy. They drive past, look, stay in the car, and then come back again. Later on, they called the cops, but I mean, you think, man, what was that? What was that thing trying to get in that car, and where did the man go? And there was no explanation to be had. But this is like a real police report. So I think they're spooky things, and then the fact that they happen in a setting of a swamp just kind of makes it all the more spooky, and sort of has this primordial, prehistoric feel to it that leaves almost it's not out of the ordinary that things go unexplained in those environments.
You have to wonder when you hear about missing person reports. Obviously, the David Paulides Missing 411 books have been very popular in our kind of field in recent times. But when you hear about stories like that, and even in Momo, there are a couple. I think one guy's relieving himself and the creature tries to grab him. And there's another account in Momo where the beast actually picks up, I think, a 4-year-old or a toddler and makes a beeline for the tree line, but just happens to drop it. I think the mother screams at it or something. So you wonder if there are these cases where people get taken by things like you just referenced in the swamp, and as I mentioned, are also in the Momo book. And this explains some of the stranger missing person accounts. Anyway, you're right. They're terrifying regardless.
Yeah, there's, I covered disappearances in here as well. Gave me an opportunity to cover some of those, any that happened to be in these swampy areas. And there was, people that just casually, hunters, experienced guys that just go in there and just are simply never seen again. And I mean, swamps are kind of dangerous places, but, it just leaves you wondering if especially after you've read all the weird stuff that's gone on in the swamp, and then I tell you about a disappearance of a guy, you just start thinking, wow, what happened? What could have gotten him? Because I just learned about all this weird stuff that's supposed to be living there. So yeah, those are really, really cool places. And, I even cover cases of missing planes that had crashed in these huge swamps that nobody could ever find. Like, I mean, literally, in some cases, I paddled some of these swamps, and I was thinking, man, I could be going right over a plane that crashed here years ago, and nobody ever found it.
Gosh. You've looked at so many various cryptids, and it looks like you're even looking at a wider range in your most recent book. And there's something just from some of your own writing so far which drew attention to something which interests me, and that's creatures with 3 toes in the track. So obviously there's stories in the Boggy Creek narrative, stories in the Momo one. You also mentioned another case in Irwin, Pennsylvania in 1973. And I've heard a number of 3-toed creature stories recently. The TV show Hellier references 3-toed creatures as well. Is that something you've heard more of beyond those accounts that I've mentioned, now that you're writing obviously about even more creatures in the swamp book?
Yeah, I've come across more 3-toed tracks. The Honey Island Swamp Monster is also allegedly has three toes. And that I have a chapter on that one, Honey Island Swamp in Louisiana. And then there's a sprinkling of these 3-toed tracks that sort of goes in with Southern Bigfoot from time to time. And a lot of people, believe that Southern Bigfoots have 3 toes. And a lot of that was perpetuated by the Legend of Boggy Creek movie, which talked about a famous 3-toed trackway. But, down here, there's plenty of Bigfoot sightings and plenty of tracks found, or ledge tracks, and most of them have 5 toes. But occasionally there will be one that has 3 toes, and those are sort of the spookier ones because now they don't fit any sort of, anatomy that we would be familiar with. And then when you get into cases like, Boggy Creek, where the creature is a little more aggressive, or the Honey Island Swamp Monster, where the thing kind of is a cross between perhaps a dog man and a Bigfoot, and, allegedly has 3 toes, or just something a little more monstrous about that. So yeah, I run across that frequently.
With Bigfoot, or Boggy Creek, I mean, did they ever mention finding any wooden structures? Because normally when you hear stories about Bigfoot, they talk about these crazy structures that they make.
No, this whole business about structures has
Hmm.
only I've only heard this kind of stuff mostly in the last, say, 5 years. It's just really
Yeah.
turned into a thing where people are proposing that Bigfoot's building these structures. In all
Hmm.
those old cases, no one ever mentioned anything like this,
Yeah.
found, unless they just did find something they couldn't explain. But you never hear about that in old reports. This is something more modern.
Really
And
new.
not to say that they're not making structures, but most of the things I've ever seen, just there's a few that defy explanation and a lot that just can be explained by, weather and decay of trees and things like that.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I don't, and specifically in Boggy Creek, and
Mm.
very few reports of structures, and the ones I have gotten are from literally like the last 2 years.
Huh.
It's interesting to see phenomenon change culturally like that. And I think you can see it in UFO accounts and obviously lots of other type of reports that fit under a broader umbrella. One of the things that interests me is when there's reports that seem to be of a different phenomenon or a different creature or a different entity, and yet there are parallels that seem like it's closer to being reflective of the same experience. And I suppose what I'm getting at isn't to say whether something's real or not real. And I'll give you an example, and then, Lyle, maybe you can say if there's anything that struck you at all like this. When I was, funnily enough, watching the Small Town Monsters Boggy Creek documentary, and I was watching the attack on you'll be able to help me, I forgot the name of the house. What's the house? Who are the people in the house that's attacked? It's
The Ford family.
the Ford family, that's right. There's the attack on the Ford family, and it rejigged my memory of the original Legend of Boggy Creek, which I hadn't watched for a while. So I went back and watched that. When you watch that Ford family attack, it really is reminiscent to me of another famous attack on a farmhouse. That's the Hopkinsville Goblin case. There's a real parallel to something outside trying to get in, people firing on the creature and it not being effective perhaps, and one person in the house kind of having a small level of a physical altercation. And there's something about those two cases that almost fits like a mythic structure, and it seems to almost narratively follow a very similar path, even though the entities are very different. Have you seen things like that in your research, where one case, which on the surface might seem very different to another case, actually has parallels, even though the phenomenon itself might be, or the location might be different, or anything like that? If what I'm saying makes sense to you.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and those kind of cases stand out, obviously, because it's not just a brief sighting of something crossing the road or what have you. This is some sort of a, lengthy engagement or a standoff, or things trying to get in the house. So, you remember those, and those are the ones that stick in people's mind. And that's why the Ford incident from the Legend of Boggy Creek is one that people ask me about a lot, because it's just, intriguing. And I do see definite similarities to that and something like the Hopkinsville Goblin incident of 1955. And those are almost kind of a little movie unto themselves. And there's a lot of similarities between what's going on, even though one involves an alleged extraterrestrial and one involves a Bigfoot-like creature. The one thing you got to kind of remember, though, definitely in the Legend of Boggy Creek movie, is that's very sensationalized. I mean, it follows the facts, but it's got to be dramatic. So what was going on there wasn't necessarily a one night standoff. There was slow buildup of these incidents that occurred, and then they did go out and shoot at it, and then they were kind of done with it because they were scared and literally moved the next day. But I've seen other cases like that. There was one I covered in my Beyond Boggy Creek book in a section where I kind of covered these sort of attack-like incidents. There was a family in Oklahoma that began to experience some Bigfoot sightings on their property. And then over time, the creatures began stealing venison from their outdoor shed. And then the things were trying to get in the house. And it just kind of perpetuated to this really crazy situation they called the BFRO, Bigfoot Research Organization out there. And those guys, they only stayed out there one night because the homeowners were firing guns and they were just so freaked out. They thought somebody's going to get shot, and they left. But yeah, so occasionally you run across these they just really stand out, and there's just, it's hard to explain, because a brief sighting, maybe, you could make a mistake. It was a bear or whatever, but it's something that's prolonged and, you've seen it several times, or it keeps trying to get in the house, become a little harder to explain in normal, terms.
And speaking of people shooting at Bigfoot, I was aware, as I think probably most people are, or a lot of people are, of the legend of, I think it's the Minnesota Iceman. But I'd never heard about the case that's in Momo. In case the listeners haven't read Momo, could you talk about the display that a witness in your Momo book remembered seeing about a frozen Bigfoot type creature?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I'm very familiar with the Minnesota Iceman case and have researched that quite a bit. And I was even on the Shipping Wars TV show episode where they transferred the sideshow version down here to Texas. But anyway,
if there's any more you want to fill in on that, I'd love to hear that as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Minnesota Iceman, for people that don't know, and this is important to the story, is it was a sort of a sideshow carnival type display that started making the rounds in 1967. And there was a carny by the name of Frank Hansen that introduced this creature that was, well, an alleged creature. It was frozen in a block of ice, and it was like on a trailer or whatever, and you could pay $1 and go in there and see it. And this was a kind of a popular type sideshow thing. But in this case, whatever was in that ice looked quite real. And a couple of notable cryptozoologists were given the opportunity to examine it, or at least look at it under the ice as best they could. And they concluded that they believed this was some sort of a real creature. And the owner, Frank Hansen, actually had several stories as to the origin of this, and I think he was trying to be vague. And anyway, it's a long, and I mean, this is a topic for a whole thing, really, because it's one of those kind of, again, it's like one of those seminal things that has become an icon of sort of the Bigfoot category. And again, this was, in the 60s and 70s, another one that occurred back then that has so much craziness to the story. But knowing that the Minnesota Iceman was sort of the most famous of these sort of hominids frozen in ice that were being shown at sideshows, I ran across a woman at a Bigfoot conference in Oklahoma. And I had given my presentation, and the first thing she told me was, which was cool enough, she said, right after the Ford incident made the newspapers back in 1971, her family, her father, decided it would be cool to go down there and look at it. So she went down there literally in the days right after the Fords had all that going on. I'm like, oh, wow, that's cool, And she said, oh, and just, conversation, by the way, back when I was young, I saw this body of some sort of a frozen primate hominid looking thing in Missouri. I'm like, really? And this was before I was going to write the Momo book. I mean, I kind of wanted to, but I hadn't really started. And she told me that in 1964, she and some friends were going to a lake swimming, and they drove by and they saw this trailer parked in a mall parking lot, and it said, see the missing link or something like that. And they decided to stop, and they paid the $1 or $2 or whatever it is and went in there and looked at it. Now, this woman's quite observant. She said she looked at it, and as she was observing it, it was some sort of a body of a hairy, upright bipedal looking thing frozen in ice. But she could see it well enough that she believed that it was real. So they give you like 5 or 10 minutes, and then you had to come out. So she kept paying her money and going back in multiple times. And she could describe this thing very accurately in full detail. And so she's telling me all this stuff. And I'm thinking, that's kind of sounds like the Minnesota Iceman. So upon first listen, I thought, well, maybe she's talking about the Minnesota Iceman. So anyway, I got the details of her story, and then she doesn't have like a smartphone or anything. So after that, I was finally a friend of hers came over and showed her a picture of the Minnesota Iceman. And she said, that's not what I saw. And I said, are you sure that was 1964? Because the Iceman didn't start till 1967. And she said, absolutely. I'm sure 100% on the year. And she goes, the weird thing is when I asked those guys where this thing came from, they said it was shot in a field by Louisiana, Missouri. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And she didn't even really know that was the site of Momo. I mean, she didn't really even put all these pieces together. She didn't even know what the Minnesota Iceman was. So I'm thinking, wow, she saw some kind of thing frozen before the Minnesota Iceman, and something that these guys had said was killed right there in the town where Momo would appear 8 years later. So very, very weird. And of course, I can never prove or disprove what this woman saw, but she was very convinced it was a real creature. And so that whole thing is a chapter in the Momo book, kind of a tangent, but one that I thought was very cool and kind of plays into the Minnesota Iceman and the Momo case all at the same time.
Yeah.
So that's how that happened. And that's just one of those lucky things. I was in the right place at the right time.
There's another story out of Missouri of an artifact that you mentioned in the Momo book, the skull of perhaps a monkey or the skull of some kind of ape found in a cave.
Yeah, wasn't able to really find much on it other than there's a lot of caves up in Missouri in around that area. People probably think of it as kind of flat or whatever, but there's some bluffs that overlook the Mississippi River, and Missouri is known for caves. And a lot of the locals were talking about this, what they called Monkey Cave. And they said there had been this primate looking skull found in there, a monkey skull or something. And of course, I'm like, really? I mean, what could this be? And it's like, just seems awfully coincidental that there's a monkey cave near a place where people report this sort of Bigfoot-like creature. So
yeah.
I began to try to find information, and one of my friends, Jerry Hestand, he's another cryptid researcher. He had some information, but we never really could run it down other than, it was just a cave where they did find some kind of skull, but of course it disappeared. No one knew what happened to it. And so you can't, analyze it or determine if it's a common primate or if was something stranger. But it's just another cool story,
It must be frustrating as a researcher when you stumble upon, I guess, almost the magic bullet, and then you can't quite locate it. Have you heard any recent stories about anybody claiming to have shot anything or have found any physical artifact that might be? Because I know both of those stories were older ones, but is there anything recently which is like that, or a tantalizing physical piece of evidence of any of these kind of cryptids?
I can't think of anything that's been too awfully tantalizing. I mean, these things come across the radar frequently, but typically now it's usually somebody with a YouTube video that is, touting that they have a Bigfoot skull or whatever, or a rock that has a face of a big fossilized Bigfoot. And these aren't things that are ever really scientifically analyzed. They're just, sort of a circus show on YouTube. And so you tend to kind of dismiss a lot of that because it's just nonsense. And that being said, occasionally somebody calls you up and has some sort of a good story. But there's been nothing that's like very recent that in terms of physical evidence or any sort of a, smoking gun in proof. The latest thing I got was, and this is the frustrating thing, like you're saying, I've had this a couple of times where a person will contact me and say, I talked to, this guy who, and in this case, he had some information on the Boggy Creek creature and the possible carcass that was found and all this. And he's like, I'm trying to get the guy to talk to you. And I'm trying to, I'm like, he tells me the story. I'm like, oh, that sounds great. And it lines up with some other stuff I've learned about that nobody else would know. But eventually it fizzles out because the person doesn't want to talk to anybody official like me or share the story beyond maybe what they've mentioned to their buddy. Those are the frustrating ones where I know that there's a person trying to get me this information, but they're at the mercy of the person who has the artifact or has the story or whatever that won't end up sharing it. So it just sort of goes cold, and neither myself nor the guy who heard the story can coax the person to give up the information.
I remember back in the heyday of Art Bell, I think he had, maybe it was even a couple different callers. I know at least one who I think may have even been on the show a couple times. He said I think he'd shot either one or two creatures that are presumably some type of Bigfoot type creature, and said he'd buried them, but he was fearful of perhaps being arrested or something. But when he died, he was going to make sure the map fell into, the right hands or something. But I'm assuming nothing ever came of that story.
Yeah, that was Bugs, as the person was known. I can't remember the exact details offhand, but I don't quote me on this, but I believe that the map that was provided ended up not matching what he had said, and it just sort of didn't match up. And of course, like most of these where somebody says they buried a Bigfoot body or they got the body, it never materializes. If you got the body, show the body. Don't say you buried it or whatever. If you're saying you buried it or the government took it, then don't bother, because that's not helping. It's like, if you got the body, let's see it.
For me, that's one of the appeals of the John Keel type position on not just the Bigfoot phenomenon, but all of these phenomena. It's something you mentioned in Momo, the idea that while these things might present themselves physically, they mightn't be physical tomorrow. They might somehow come and go or be manifestations of something. Were there, for example, many cases, say in your new upcoming Sinister Swamps book, where you would hear a case and then that kind of John Keel type theory would come to your mind and you'd think maybe this is something which somehow comes and goes and isn't here all of the time?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you kind of, the more you read and the more you know about these kind of cases, you have to consider things like that. I mean, I pretty much started as most, cryptozoology based in what I believe is like Bigfoot. It's a flesh and blood creature, some sort of a undiscovered primate. But of course, when you start looking at cases like Mothman and all these other type things, they're much harder to explain than a Bigfoot. A Bigfoot seems to make some amount of sense. There's something you can connect it to in a very grounded terrestrial type creature. When you start getting into flying humanoids and things that defy anatomy or biology, the case of the lizard man, where I researched people who had reported seeing a reptilian, sort of a creature from the Black Lagoon type creature in South Carolina. while they described it as, I saw this thing and it was there, and, you just thinking, how do you explain that? And then you get into the swamps and there's all sorts of weird stories of, prehistoric birds and things that are seen and, disappear. And, you think, well, is this some sort of things flying through time or dimension or space? And, John Keel and all the books you read about that and all the weird stuff, you just kind of say, I don't know. Any theory is as good as the next, because we're just basically trying to explain this phenomenon. And my basic grounded sort of view of it is, people are seeing weird stuff. That's true. You're not making it up. They're not hallucinating. That doesn't mean all things that everybody's reported are not mistaken identity or something. I mean, sure, people could have mistaken a bear for a Bigfoot or a shadow for a Bigfoot, but there's a certain amount of those cases that simply can't be explained. And if you've interviewed some certain witnesses, you feel confident that they saw what they said they saw. That leaves you with trying to find out what it is they saw. It's not that they, didn't see something. It's, what did they see? And that's where all those sort of wild theories come into play. I don't pretend to know the best answer for that, other than I collect the stories and the more I research and the more I look into specific areas or specific cases, the more that I have, or the more data I have to analyze to try to figure out, is it something that can be explained or not? And so the swamp, there's just tons of that.
When's that book gonna hit as well? Do you know yet, Lyle?
Hopefully soon. It was supposed to have come out, actually, but because of this, the pandemic situation, it has delayed almost everything. And all my events were canceled, and my timeline for getting things done in a timely manner has been thrown out the window. So I'm trying to go ahead and push it through. I even debated whether I should just release it now or later, but I think I'm just going to forge ahead. So it should come out in late May. It's my hopeful guess.
I can't wait to read it. And before we let you go, here's a question. You're somebody who really seems to have your finger on the pulse of the broader kind of cryptid field. What do you think that is the direction of investigations into all of these things in the future? Do you see it going in a particular way, or do you see a particular theory becoming dominant, or what's your feeling of how this is going to continue?
I think that the more outlandish theories, or the more complex theories, are somewhat coming in more into prominence now. And I think that's because when you go so long without proving any of this, for example, Bigfoot, 50 years plus of trying to prove what people are seeing out there, it's invited a whole new wave of people who have some really wild theories and beliefs about what those creatures actually are. And so I've seen that kind of take over, from where I was, say a decade ago. There's so much more of that, and there's so many more people with Bigfoot groups and, pictures of structures and shadows in the woods. It's just so much stuff now. And so many just wild assumptions based on belief instead of any sort of scientific approach whatsoever. Yeah. That has sort of kind of created a lot of white noise in the research. And I can't speak necessarily for ghost hunting and UFO, but I'm sure the more people that are involved, the longer it is in which we can't prove something, the more people begin to try to think of new ways to explain it. So I think the future of it is that, people will continue to entertain wild theories, and maybe that's just the nature of it. But for me, there's still great stories and still strange things going on that I document, and I don't really try to focus on trying to prove any of it. That's a whole nother thing there. I just try to document and tell it as it is, and try to, like for Momo, for example, if it's something that people, oh yeah, Momo, Missouri Monster, or whatever, that was, I think it's a Bigfoot. Well, nobody's really ever nobody had written a book that was dedicated to the whole case. And so some of these I've gone back and tried to assemble everything and write a case. So at least now there's a book on it. If people want to know the whole story, there it is. Instead of just looking at some blogs, which are just a bunch of copied stuff from Lauren Coleman that get perpetuated over and over and over. That's, so my role in this is to continue to research and tell the stories, and let everybody else figure out what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Please keep doing what you're doing, because your books are fantastic, and I can't wait for Sinister Swamps, Monsters and Mysteries from the Mire. So as soon as that hits, I'll be buying a copy. But thank you so much for coming on the show with us tonight, Lyle. You were just a wonderful guest.
No problem. I appreciate you having me.
Lyle Blackburn was just an incredible guest, and a wealth of information on all things Bigfoot and cryptid. Make sure to check out his official website at lyleblackburn.com. Autographed copies of Lyle's books are available directly from his website. Regular copies are available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iTunes, and Kobo. When visiting Lyle's website, you can also order DVDs of his fantastic documentaries that Lyle has made with small town monsters, or stream them instantly on Amazon Prime or Vimeo. Of course, you can always find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Dean and I would really appreciate it. Next week, join us again as we take another conversational journey into the realms of mystery and strangeness. Until then, keep it weird.